The goblet trembled in Lyra's hands as she lifted it to her lips inside the king's private chamber, and somewhere behind her, a door she thought was locked creaked open. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She had counted on 10 more seconds. 10 seconds to taste the wine, swallow, wait for the burn that would tell her something was wrong, and then slip away before anyone noticed she had ever been there. She did not get those 10 seconds. Footsteps stopped at the threshold, heavy, certain, the footsteps of someone who never had to knock on his own door. Lyra did not turn around. For one desperate heartbeat she thought that if she stayed perfectly still, if she became invisible the way she had trained herself to be invisible for years, the moment would simply pass her by. It did not. "What?" said a voice low and cold as winter stone. "Do you think you are doing with my wine?" She knew that voice. Every servant in the palace knew that voice, because it belonged to King Draven, ruler of the Aldmere throne, an alpha whose temper was spoken of in hushed tones in the kitchens, and whose silence was said to be more frightening than his anger. Lyra had spent 3 years working in this palace, specifically, to never be close enough to hear that voice directed at her. Now it was close, too close. She turned, and the goblet nearly slipped from her fingers. King Draven stood in the doorway, still dressed in the dark formal coat he had worn to the evening council, his sharp eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the room feel smaller than it was. He was tall in the way that made grown men lower their gazes, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from discipline rather than softness. Omega instinct screamed at her to bow her head, to shrink, to apologize before she even understood what she was apologizing for. She did all three at once. "Your Majesty, Her voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again. "I did not mean to intrude." "You are standing in my private chamber," Draven said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him with a quiet click that felt louder than a slamming gate, "holding my cup, having clearly just drunk from it. Explain yourself before I call the guard." The guard. Lyra's stomach dropped at the words. She had heard stories of what happened to servants accused of tampering with a king's food. Some were dismissed. Some, if the king was in a foul mood, were never seen in the palace again. She thought of her mother, waiting in the small house at the edge of Millbrook Village, depending on the coin Lyra sent home every month. If she lost this position, if she was thrown in a cell, her mother would have nothing. Fear made her honest, because she could not think fast enough to build a lie. "I was checking it," she said quickly. "The wine. I check it every night before it is brought to your table. I have done it for months. I take a small sip first, and then I wait, to see if anything is wrong with it, before your cupbearer carries it in." Draven's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, like a blade catching the light. "You have been tasting my wine, secretly, for months." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Why?" The question landed harder than she expected. Why? It was a simple word, and yet answering it honestly meant peeling back a layer of herself she had never shown to anyone in this palace, not even the other maids she worked beside every day. "Because I heard the guards talking," she said, staring at the floor, because she could not bear to look at him while she spoke. "Weeks ago, 2 of them, near the kitchen stairs. They said there were whispers of danger to you, someone wanting to see you removed from the throne. I did not know if it was true, or just gossip that soldiers tell each other to pass the time, but I could not stop thinking about it. So you decided, on your own, without informing anyone, to test my food for poison." When he said it aloud like that, it sounded almost foolish. A servant girl, barely noticed by anyone in the great halls of Aldmere, appointing herself protector of a king who did not know her name. She felt her face grow hot with shame. "I did not think anyone would believe a maid if I reported a rumor," she admitted. "And I did not want anything to happen to you because I stayed quiet." For a long moment, Draven said nothing. He crossed the room slowly, and Lyra had to fight every instinct in her body that told her to step back. Alphas of his rank did not usually stand this close to Omegas, who were not their mates, or their chosen guards, and the nearness of him, the sheer weight of his presence, made her knees feel unsteady. He picked up the goblet from where she had set it down on the polished table, and studied the dark red wine inside, as though it might answer questions she could not. "You could be lying to me," he said finally. "You could be part of whatever plot the guards were gossiping about. Perhaps you tasted the wine because you knew it was safe, and you wanted me to trust you before delivering something far worse. I understand why you would think that, Lyra said, and she was surprised at how steady her voice had become, now that the worst of the shock had passed. But if you truly believed that, I think you would have already called for the guard, instead of asking me questions. Something flickered across his face. It was not quite amusement, but it was close enough that Lyra's pulse skipped in a different way than fear. Bold words for someone caught trespassing in the king's chamber, he said. I am not trying to be bold, Your Majesty. I am only trying to tell you the truth, because I do not know how to do anything else right now. He studied her for a long moment, and Lyra felt as though every secret she had ever kept was being read from her face like words on a page. She was aware, suddenly, of how she must look to him, plain gray dress, hair pinned back without care, hands still slightly trembling from the fright of being caught. She was nothing like the polished nobles who filled his court, nothing like the powerful alphas who advised him, nothing like anyone who should have caught the attention of a king even for a single moment. And yet his attention was entirely on her. What is your name? He asked. She blinked, startled that he would ask. In 3 years of working in this palace, she had never once been asked her name by anyone above the rank of head housekeeper. Lyra, she said. Lyra Ashwood. Lyra Ashwood. He repeated it slowly, as if testing the shape of it in his mouth. And how long have you served in this palace? 3 years, Your Majesty. In that time, has anyone ever asked you to test my food or drink? Any instruction from the head steward, the kitchen master, anyone at all? No, it was only me, my own decision. Draven set the goblet down and folded his arms, studying her the way a man studies a puzzle whose pieces do not quite fit the picture he expected. That is either the truth, or it is a very well-constructed lie. I have not decided which yet. Lyra's hands twisted into the fabric of her skirt. May I ask what will happen to me now? That depends, Draven said, on what I find when I look into your story. If you are lying, Lyra Ashwood, you will regret it in ways I do not need to describe. If you are telling the truth. He paused, and for the first time since he had entered the room, something almost gentle passed through his stern features, gone as quickly as it appeared. Then you have been risking your own safety every night to protect a king who did not even know you existed. That is not a small thing. I only wanted to help, she whispered. I did not think of it as risk. I thought of it as something I could do, when there was nothing else within my power to do. There is always risk in swallowing something meant for someone else, whether or not you think of it that way. His voice had lost some of its earlier coldness, though the authority in it had not softened at all. Poison does not always announce itself quickly. Sometimes it takes hours. Sometimes it looks like nothing more than a stomach ailment, until it is too late to save the person who drank it. Lyra had not truly let herself consider this before, not in the way his words forced her to now. She had thought of her nightly ritual as a small act of quiet loyalty, something almost symbolic. She had not truly pictured what would happen to her, alone in the servants' quarters, if the wine one night had actually carried something meant to kill. I did not think that far ahead, she admitted. I only thought about you. The words left her mouth before she could catch them, and she immediately wished she could pull them back. They sounded far too intimate for a servant to say to a king she had met, properly, only minutes ago. Draven's eyes narrowed slightly, though not with anger. It was closer to curiosity, the look of a man encountering something he had not expected to find inside his own palace walls. You should not be doing this alone, he said at last. If there truly is a threat against me, and if you insist on continuing this habit of yours, it needs to be done properly, with knowledge of what to watch for, and with someone aware of where you are and when. Does that mean you believe me? It means, Draven said, that I intend to find out exactly how much of what you have told me is true. Until then, you will not return to your usual duties in the lower halls. You will be reassigned, effective tonight, to serve within my personal household staff, where I can see you and speak with you as needed. Lyra's breath caught. It was not the punishment she had feared, but it was not exactly relief either. Serving directly within the king's household meant being near him constantly, under the watchful eyes of guards and senior staff, who would surely wonder why a lower maid had been elevated so suddenly. It meant scrutiny from every corner of the palace, and possibly resentment from those who had served him far longer without ever earning such a position. Your Majesty, I do not think I am suited for such close service. I have no training for—" "That is not a request, Lyra Ashwood." His tone left no room for argument, though there was no cruelty in it either. "You involved yourself in matters concerning my safety, the moment you lifted that cup to your lips. You do not get to decide, now that you would prefer to remain uninvolved." She lowered her eyes, unable to argue with the truth of what he said, even as her stomach twisted with nerves at the thought of what tomorrow would bring. "As you wish." Draven turned toward the window, where the last light of evening was fading into deep blue behind the mountains that ringed the capital city. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. 3 years in this palace, and no one thought to ask your name until tonight. That should not have been true. I intend to correct it." Lyra did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all, standing very still in the dim golden light of the chamber, acutely aware that whatever life she had built for herself in the shadows of the palace had just changed forever, in the space of a single interrupted sip of wine. He turned back to her, his expression once again schooled into the careful neutrality of a ruler. "Go to the head housekeeper. Tell her you have been reassigned by my direct order. She will know what that means, and she will not question it, whatever rumors follow in the morning. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "And Lyra." He waited until she looked up at him, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "If someone truly is planning to move against me, and you continue insisting on placing yourself in the path of that danger, I expect you to tell me everything you hear, everything you notice, no matter how small it seems. Do not decide on your own again what is worth mentioning and what is not. That decision nearly cost you your safety tonight, and it could cost far more than that the next time." "I understand," she said, and meant it, though a small, frightened part of her wondered exactly what kind of danger she had truly stepped into, and whether serving closer to the king would protect her, or simply place her directly in the path of whatever storm was already gathering somewhere within the walls of Aldmere. She left his chamber that night, with her heart still racing, uncertain whether she had just escaped disaster, or walked willingly toward it, and utterly unaware that the guard's whispered warning about danger to the crown had barely begun to reveal how deep the threat truly ran. Nora found Lyra sitting on the edge of her narrow bed at midnight, still fully dressed, staring at the small bundle of belongings she had already packed without quite remembering doing it. "You look like you have seen a ghost," Nora whispered, closing the door of the shared servants' room behind her. She was the closest thing Lyra had to a friend in the palace, a cheerful kitchen maid, with quick hands and quicker opinions. "The housekeeper came by an hour ago saying you have been moved to the king's personal household." "Personal household? Lyra, do you know what people are already saying?" "I can imagine," Lyra murmured. "They are saying you must have caught his eye somehow. Some are saying worse things." Nora sat beside her, lowering her voice further. "Tell me it is not true. Tell me you have not done something reckless." Lyra hesitated, then told her, in a whisper barely louder than breath, exactly what had happened in the king's chamber that evening. Nora's eyes grew wider with every word, until by the end she looked as though she might faint from the sheer improbability of it. "You tasted the king's wine, for poison, on your own, and he caught you doing it." "Yes. And he did not have you thrown in the dungeon." "No." "Lyra." Nora grabbed her hands, squeezing tightly. "Do you understand what kind of danger you have put yourself in? If there really is a plot against the king, and you are now standing directly beside him every day, tasting his food, sleeping near his chambers, you have made yourself a target. Whoever wants him gone will not care that you are only a maid." The words settled into Lyra's chest, like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of fear through her that had not fully surfaced, until Nora said them aloud. She had been so consumed by the fear of being caught, of losing her position, that she had not fully considered what it would mean to continue this work openly, under a title, with everyone in the palace aware of what she did. "I did not choose this," Lyra said quietly. "He ordered it." "Then you must be very careful," Nora said, releasing her hands and standing to pace the small room. "Watch everyone. Trust no one, not even people who smile at you kindly. If someone truly wants the king gone, they will look for any weakness, and right now, you are standing very close to him." Lyra nodded slowly, though she still did not fully grasp the shape of the danger Nora was describing. It was one thing to hear rumors from guards passing in a corridor, It was another thing entirely to be told, by someone who cared for her safety, that she had walked directly into the center of whatever storm was building around the throne. She reported to the king's private wing early the next morning, dressed in a fresh uniform that marked her, for the first time in her life, as part of the inner household staff. The other servants who worked closest to Draven looked at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. A tall, severe woman named Greta, who managed the daily schedule of the king's personal staff, looked her up and down with obvious disapproval. "So you are the one," Greta said, not bothering to soften her tone. "The maid from the lower halls, who has somehow found herself promoted overnight." "I was reassigned by the king's order," Lyra said, keeping her eyes lowered, as she had been trained to do around senior staff. "I know exactly whose order it was. What I do not know is why." Greta studied her the way a butcher studies a cut of meat, deciding whether it was worth the price being asked. "Whatever happened between you and His Majesty, do not think it earns you special treatment here. You will work harder than everyone else in this wing, simply to prove you deserve to remain in it." Lyra accepted the challenge without argument, because arguing had never once worked in her favor, not in 3 years of palace service, and certainly not on her first morning in a position everyone assumed she had not earned honestly. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of new duties and constant, exhausting awareness. She learned the layout of the king's private wing, the names of the guards who stood watch at each entrance, the schedule of meals brought up from the kitchen. She continued her nightly ritual of testing his food, though now it was done openly, under Greta's watchful and skeptical eye, with a small measured spoon rather than a stolen sip from his own cup. Draven himself remained distant during those first days, speaking to her only when necessary, giving instructions through Greta rather than directly. Lyra told herself this was for the best. It would quiet the whispers among the staff, and it would remind her of the boundary that existed between them, a boundary she had briefly forgotten in the tense, intimate minutes of that first conversation in his chamber. And yet, she found herself watching him more than she should have. She noticed the way exhaustion sat heavy behind his eyes during long council sessions. She noticed how rarely he smiled, and how genuine it looked on the few occasions it appeared, as if it were a muscle he did not often use. She noticed, too, the way his gaze sometimes lingered on her across a room, only to snap away the instant she looked back, as though he had caught himself doing something he had not intended. On the 5th night of her new position, everything nearly went wrong. She had prepared his evening meal tray as usual, tasting each dish carefully, before allowing it to be carried into his private dining chamber. Everything seemed ordinary. The roasted fowl, the seasoned vegetables, the dark bread still warm from the oven. It was only as she lifted the small cup of tea meant to accompany the meal that she noticed something faint and strange in the scent rising from the liquid, something bitter beneath the usual fragrance of herbs that should not have been there. Her hands went still. She lowered her face closer, breathing in carefully, and the wrongness of it settled into her stomach like a cold stone. She had spent enough time around the palace healer, asking careful questions under the guise of curiosity, to recognize the sharp, faintly metallic undertone of a substance that did not belong in any tea meant for drinking. "Something is wrong with this," she said quietly to the young footman waiting beside her to carry the tray inside. "It looks the same as always," he said, frowning. "Take the tray to the kitchen. Do not let anyone touch it. I need to speak with the king immediately." The footman hesitated, clearly torn between following her instruction and questioning why a maid who had only just arrived in this wing believed she had the authority to delay the king's meal. But something in Lyra's expression, the pale certainty in her eyes, convinced him to obey without further argument. She found Draven still seated at his desk, reviewing documents by candlelight, his private secretary standing nearby with a stack of correspondence. He looked up sharply when she entered without waiting to be announced, an act that would have earned any other servant immediate reprimand. "Your Majesty, I believe the tea prepared for your evening meal has been tampered with," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The scent is wrong. I did not taste it, in case it truly is dangerous, but I did not want it served to you without warning." Draven set down his papers immediately, his expression sharpening into the focused intensity she had seen only once before, on the night he caught her in his chamber. "Where is it now?" "In the kitchen, untouched since I noticed the smell. I told the footman not to let anyone near it." He rose from his desk at once, moving with a purpose that made the candlelight seem to bend around him. "Take me there." The kitchen fell into stunned silence when the king himself walked through its doors, something that had likely never happened in the history of the palace. Draven examined the offending cup of tea closely, careful not to touch the liquid itself, before calling for the palace healer to be summoned immediately for testing. The results, delivered within the hour, by a healer, whose hands shook slightly as she reported them, confirmed exactly what Lyra had feared. A small but dangerous quantity of a slow-acting substance had been mixed into the tea, something that would not have caused immediate harm, but would have built steadily in the body over repeated exposure, mimicking the symptoms of a common illness until it was too late to reverse the damage. If this had gone unnoticed for even a few more evenings, the healer said quietly, the effects might have become impossible to treat. Draven's jaw tightened as he absorbed the information, and when he turned to look at Lyra, something in his expression had shifted entirely from the careful distance he had maintained over the past several days. It was no longer curiosity or suspicion in his eyes. It was something closer to gratitude, layered beneath a deep and simmering anger, directed at whoever had dared to reach this close to him. "You saved my life tonight," he said quietly, in a voice meant only for her, though the room around them had gone utterly silent. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to repay." "You do not owe me anything," Lyra said softly. "I only did what I promised I would do." But even as she said the words, she understood that everything had changed. The threat against the king was no longer a rumor whispered between guards near a stairwell. It was real, close, and clearly patient enough to wait for the right moment to strike again. And now, more than ever, Lyra understood that she had placed herself directly in its path, with no way of stepping back even if she had wanted to. Draven ordered the kitchen sealed for immediate investigation, and every member of staff who had touched the tray that evening questioned before morning. As the healer packed away her instruments, and the guards began their search for answers, Draven remained beside Lyra a moment longer than necessary, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear it. "Whoever did this knows the palace well enough to reach my private kitchen. That means they are close, Lyra. Closer than either of us would like to believe." His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching despite the danger they both now understood far too clearly. "From tonight forward, you do not test my food alone. Wherever I eat, you will be nearby. I cannot afford to lose the one person in this palace who noticed what everyone else missed." Lyra nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else she did not yet have a name for, something that had nothing to do with the danger surrounding them, and everything to do with the way he looked at her in that quiet, candlelit kitchen, as though she mattered more than her rank had ever suggested she could. The kitchen investigation stretched through the night and into the gray hours of dawn, and by the time the sun rose over Aldmere, 3 servants had been questioned, released, and quietly reassigned to duties far from the royal wing, though none of them showed any sign of guilt beyond simple proximity to the tainted tray. Whoever had poisoned the tea had been careful enough to leave no obvious trail, which troubled Draven far more than an obvious suspect would have. "A clumsy enemy makes mistakes we can catch," he told his chief advisor, a lean, gray-haired man named Edmund, who had served the crown for over 2 decades. "A careful one waits, watches, and tries again, when we have grown comfortable believing the danger has passed." Edmund glanced toward Lyra, who stood quietly near the window of the council room, present at Draven's insistence, despite the raised eyebrows of the nobles gathered around the table. "Your Majesty, if I may ask plainly, why does the maid remain in this meeting? Matters of court security are not typically discussed in front of household staff." "Because she is the reason we are having this conversation at all, rather than planning a funeral," Draven said flatly, and the room fell silent. Lyra noticed what an entire kitchen staff, trained and experienced, did not. "From this point forward, she has my trust, and that means she has a place in any discussion concerning my safety." Lyra felt the weight of every gaze in the room turned toward her, some curious, some doubtful, one in particular sharp with an interest that made her skin prickle uncomfortably. It belonged to a nobleman seated near the far end of the table, a broad alpha lord named Alden Voss, whose family held significant influence in the southern territories of the kingdom. He studied her with an expression that was polite on the surface, but carried something colder underneath, something she could not quite name. "A remarkable talent for a servant," Alden said smoothly, his voice carrying just enough charm to make the comment sound like a compliment, rather than the veiled suspicion it clearly was. "Tell me, girl, how did you come to recognize the scent of a poison that our own trained healers failed to notice sooner?" "I did not recognize the poison itself, my lord," Lyra said carefully, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered, though she could feel his attention pressing on her like a physical weight. "I only noticed that the tea smelled different from how it usually does. I have prepared and tasted His Majesty's meals every night for months. I know the ordinary scent of things well enough to notice when something is wrong. How fortunate for the king that you happen to be paying such close attention." Alden's smile did not reach his eyes. "One might almost think you were expecting something to go wrong." The insinuation hung in the air, and Lyra understood at once what he was suggesting, that her quick discovery of the poison was itself suspicious, that perhaps she had known about the plot in advance, or worse, that she had staged the entire incident to secure her new position within the king's household. Her chest tightened with the familiar helplessness of being accused, the same fear that had gripped her the night Draven first caught her, except this time there was an audience of powerful nobles watching to see how she would respond. Before she could find her voice, Draven spoke first, his tone cutting through the room like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Lord Voss, if you are suggesting that the woman who saved my life is somehow responsible for endangering it, I would advise you to choose your next words with considerable care." Alden inclined his head in smooth apology, though the challenge in his eyes did not fully fade. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I meant no accusation, only caution. In times like these, it is wise to question even those closest to the throne, is it not? Loyalty can be a convincing performance for those clever enough to manage it." "I have questioned her already, thoroughly, and I have questioned the circumstances of that night from every angle available to me," Draven replied. "My conclusions are my own to draw, and they do not require your input, however generously offered." The meeting continued, though the tension in the room did not fully dissolve, and Lyra spent the remainder of it acutely aware of Alden's occasional glances in her direction, each one carrying the same cold calculation she had noticed from the start. When the council finally dispersed, she found herself lingering near the doorway, watching him depart with two of his personal guards trailing close behind, and she could not shake the feeling that she had just made an enemy far more dangerous than she had realized. "You handled that well," Draven said quietly, once the room had emptied, coming to stand beside her near the window overlooking the palace gardens below. "I did not handle it at all. You spoke before I could say anything. Because Alden Voss is not a man who responds well to hesitation. Show him weakness, even briefly, and he will use it against you at the first opportunity." Draven's gaze followed the Lord's retreating figure through the garden path outside. "His family has long resented my father's decision to favor the northern territories in matters of trade. He has never openly opposed the crown, but he has never been fully loyal to it either. Do you believe he could be behind the poisoning? I believe he is capable of it, given sufficient motive and opportunity. Whether he is responsible, I cannot yet say with certainty." Draven turned to look at her directly, his expression thoughtful. "But I noticed the way he studied you tonight, Lyra. That was not simple curiosity. He recognizes that you have become important to me, and men like Alden Voss do not waste their attention on things that do not concern their own ambitions." The idea that she had somehow become a piece on whatever political board these powerful men were playing settled uneasily in her stomach. She had spent her entire life trying to remain small and unnoticed, precisely to avoid the kind of danger that came with being noticed by people who held power over her fate. Now, in the span of less than a week, she had become visible to the most powerful men in the kingdom, and not all of that visibility felt safe. "What should I do?" she asked quietly. "Continue exactly as you have been. Trust your instincts, as you did with the tea. Report anything unusual to me directly, no matter how small it seems." He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, in a way that had little to do with fear. "And be careful around Alden Voss specifically. Do not be alone with him, and do not accept anything from his household, food, drink, or otherwise, until we understand more clearly where his loyalties truly lie." Over the following days, Lyra settled slowly into the rhythm of her new position, though the wariness Draven had instilled in her never fully faded. She learned to move through the palace with a heightened awareness she had never needed before, cataloging faces, noting who lingered too long near the kitchens, who watched the king's movements with more interest than simple court politics required. Greta, though still gruff and demanding, began to soften slightly toward her as the days passed, impressed despite herself by Lyra's diligence and the quiet competence she brought to even the smallest tasks. "You work harder than most nobles' daughters, who come through here pretending to serve for the sake of appearances," Greta remarked one evening, watching Lyra carefully fold linens with practiced precision. Whatever caught the king's attention that first night, it was not only luck. "Thank you," Lyra said, surprised by the rare compliment. "Do not thank me yet. Working hard will keep you employed. It will not keep you safe, not with the kind of enemies that poisoning has stirred up." Greta's expression grew serious. "I have served in this palace longer than you have been alive, girl. I have seen ambitious men reach for the throne before, and I have seen what happens to the people caught standing too close to the king when they make their move. Watch yourself carefully." The warning settled into Lyra's chest, alongside all the others she had received, forming a quiet, constant hum of caution beneath everything she did. And yet, despite the danger circling ever closer, she found herself unable to regret the choice that had led her here, to this strange new position at the heart of the palace, standing closer to a king who had begun to look at her not as a servant to be managed, but as someone whose presence he had quietly, almost reluctantly, come to depend upon. It was during a quiet evening nearly 2 weeks after the poisoning attempt that Draven sought her out directly for the first time since that tense night in the kitchen, finding her alone in the small sitting room adjacent to his study, where she had been mending a torn curtain by lamplight. "You do not need to do that yourself," he said, startling her from the doorway. "There are servants specifically assigned to such tasks." "I do not mind it," Lyra said, setting the needle down carefully. "It gives my hands something to do while my mind is occupied with other things." "And what occupies your mind tonight?" She hesitated, uncertain how much honesty was appropriate between them, before deciding, as she had that first night in his chamber, that honesty was the only thing she truly knew how to offer. "The way he looked at me during the council meeting, I cannot stop wondering if I have made things worse for you simply by being here." Draven crossed the room and settled into the chair across from her, an act so informal and unexpected that Lyra nearly forgot to breathe. "You have made things safer for me, not worse. Whatever risk your presence has created, it is far outweighed by the danger that would already have claimed my life without your caution that night." "I do not feel as though I deserve that kind of trust," she admitted quietly. "I am only a maid, Your Majesty. I have no training in politics, no understanding of the games these nobles play. I worry that I will make a mistake that costs you far more than any poison could." "You underestimate yourself." His voice carried a gentleness she had not expected from a king known throughout the realm for his coldness. "In 3 years of palace service, you noticed a threat that trained guards and experienced healers missed entirely. That is not something learned through political training. It is something learned through paying attention to the world in a way that most people, myself included, too often fail to do." Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks under the weight of his praise, unused to being seen so clearly by anyone, let alone by the king himself. "I only did what felt right," she said softly. "That is precisely why I trust you," Draven replied, his eyes holding hers steadily in the lamplight. "Because you did not do it for reward, or recognition, or advancement. You did it because it felt right to protect someone, even a king who had never once acknowledged your existence. That kind of loyalty cannot be bought, Lyra Ashwood, and it cannot be faked convincingly enough to fool me for long. Whatever Alden Voss believes about you, I know the truth, and that is enough." The quiet conviction in his voice settled something uncertain within her chest, even as the danger surrounding them both continued to gather, unseen, somewhere in the shadows of the palace, waiting patiently for its next opportunity to strike. Word of the poisoning attempt could not stay contained within the palace walls forever, and within days, whispered versions of the story had spread through the capital city itself, growing stranger and more exaggerated with every retelling. By the time it reached the market stalls near the eastern gate, the tale had transformed into something closer to legend, a servant girl who had somehow sensed danger through instinct alone, and thrown herself between the king and certain death. Lyra heard fragments of these rumors from Nora, who visited her during a rare shared break between duties, practically bursting with the need to share what she had overheard from a merchant's wife that morning. "They are calling you the king's shadow," Nora said, settling onto the bench beside her, in the small courtyard reserved for staff. "Some say you have the gift of foresight, passed down through Omega bloodlines from the old healing houses. Others say you are secretly of noble birth, sent to protect him under disguise." "That is ridiculous," Lyra said, though she could not help the small, disbelieving laugh that escaped her. "I have no gift of foresight. I simply have a good sense of smell and a habit of paying close attention to things. Try telling that to the girl selling bread near the fountain. She nearly refused to take my coin when she heard I worked in the same wing as you, as though standing near you might bring her good fortune." Nora shook her head, smiling. "Whatever you think of yourself, Lyra, the whole city has decided you are something remarkable." The attention, however flattering Nora seemed to find it, left Lyra deeply uneasy. She had spent her entire life cultivating invisibility as a form of safety, understanding instinctively that servants who drew notice, whether through beauty, misfortune, or scandal, rarely fared well in a world governed by the ambitions of nobles far above their station. Now, seemingly overnight, she had become the subject of gossip stretching well beyond the palace walls, and she could not shake the feeling that such visibility made her a far easier target for whoever had tried to poison the king in the first place. Her fears proved justified sooner than she expected. 3 days after Nora's visit, Lyra was sent on an errand to retrieve fresh herbs from the palace's private garden, a task she had performed dozens of times without incident. The garden sat at the edge of the royal grounds, bordered by a low stone wall and shaded by ancient oak trees that had stood since before the current dynasty claimed the throne. She moved through the rows of fragrant plants with practiced efficiency, gathering the herbs the kitchen required for the evening meal, when the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel made her look up. Alden Voss stood several paces away, alone, his expression carrying none of the smooth charm he had displayed in the council chamber. Here, away from the watchful presence of the king and his advisors, something colder and more direct had replaced it. "Lady Ashwood," he said, using a title she had never claimed and did not deserve, his tone dripping with mockery. "How fortunate to find you unaccompanied." Lyra's heart began to pound, every instinct she possessed screaming at her to retreat, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm, remembering Draven's warning about showing weakness to this man. "My lord, I did not realize anyone else was using the garden this afternoon." "I was not using it. I was waiting for you." He took a slow step closer, and Lyra fought the urge to step back, understanding that retreat would only confirm whatever weakness he was searching to exploit. "I find myself curious about you, Lyra Ashwood. A maid who rises from obscurity to the king's closest confidence in the span of a single week is either extraordinarily gifted or extraordinarily convenient for someone with an agenda. I have no agenda beyond my duties, my lord." "So you claim." His eyes swept over her with an assessing coldness that made her skin crawl. "Tell me, has it occurred to you that a poisoning attempt so conveniently discovered, so perfectly timed to elevate an unknown servant into the king's inner circle, might itself be worth questioning? Perhaps whoever arranged that poison intended precisely this outcome." A grateful king, blind with relief, placing his trust in exactly the person who orchestrated the danger in the first place. The accusation struck with such calculated precision that Lyra felt momentarily breathless, understanding at once the dangerous cleverness of what Alden was suggesting. If such a theory took hold among the court, if even a fraction of the nobility began to believe she had staged the poisoning herself to gain favor, her position, and quite possibly her safety, would collapse entirely, regardless of how thoroughly untrue the accusation was. "That is not what happened," she said, her voice steadier than the fear churning in her stomach. "I discovered the poison because I have tasted His Majesty's food and drink every night for months, long before anyone in this palace knew my name. If I wished to manufacture such a scheme, my lord, I would have chosen a far less dangerous way to draw attention to myself than personally consuming small amounts of tainted food for months on the chance it might eventually prove useful." Something flickered across Alden's face, brief but unmistakable, a flash of genuine surprise at the sharpness of her response. He had clearly expected her to falter, to stammer and retreat under the weight of his accusation, and her steady refusal to do so seemed to unsettle him more than any denial alone could have. "Careful, girl," he said, his voice dropping lower, losing some of its earlier smoothness. Confidence looks poorly on a servant who forgets her place. The king's favor is a fragile thing, and kings have been known to change their minds quickly when convenient evidence presents itself. Is that a threat, my lord? It is. An observation. He smiled, though the expression held no warmth whatsoever. I would advise you to consider carefully whose interests you truly serve, Lyra Ashwood, before you find yourself standing alone when the tide of court favor inevitably shifts, as it always does. He turned and walked away without waiting for her response, leaving Lyra standing motionless among the herb rows, her hands trembling around the small basket she had been filling. The encounter left her shaken, in a way the poisoning discovery itself had not, because this was not an abstract danger lurking somewhere in the shadows of the palace. This was a direct, personal threat, delivered with the calm confidence of a man who clearly believed he held more power in this situation than she did. She did not immediately report the encounter to Draven, uncertain how to explain it without sounding as though she were seeking sympathy or attempting to further poison his opinion of Alden Voss through her own accusations. It was only that evening, as she prepared his meal tray under Greta's watchful supervision, that her hands shook badly enough for the older woman to notice. "What happened to you?" Greta asked, setting down the tray she had been arranging and studying Lyra's pale face with unexpected concern. "Nothing. I am only tired." "Do not insult me with obvious lies, girl. I have managed this household long enough to recognize fear when it is sitting directly in front of me." Greta's expression softened slightly, an unusual gentleness breaking through her typically stern demeanor. "Whatever it is, you should tell His Majesty. He has made it clear you are to report anything unusual directly to him, and I have never known him to make such an instruction lightly." Reluctantly, once the evening meal had been served and the private dining chamber had emptied of other staff, Lyra found the courage to recount the encounter in the garden to Draven, watching his expression darken with each detail she provided. By the time she finished, his jaw had tightened into a hard line, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, despite the fire burning steadily in the hearth beside them. "He approached you alone, deliberately, and suggested that you orchestrated an attempt on my life," Draven repeated slowly, as though confirming he had understood correctly. "And then he threatened you, however carefully disguised as observation. I did not want to trouble you with it, Your Majesty. I was uncertain whether it was significant enough to—" "It is significant," Draven interrupted, his voice sharp with an anger Lyra had not seen directed anywhere but at the abstract threat of poison until now. "Alden Voss does not waste his time on idle mockery. If he approached you directly, alone, with a theory designed specifically to undermine your position and your safety, it means he sees you as a genuine obstacle to whatever he is planning. Do you believe he is responsible for the poisoning then?" "I believe he has grown considerably more suspicious than mere political rivalry would explain," Draven said, rising from his chair and moving toward the window with the restless energy of a man forced to contain frustration he could not yet act upon. "But suspicion alone is not proof, and Alden Voss commands enough loyalty among the southern lords that accusing him without solid evidence would risk fracturing the kingdom rather than protecting it. Then what can be done?" Draven turned back to face her, his expression grim but resolute. "We watch him carefully, and we ensure you are never alone in a place he might reach you again. I will assign a guard to accompany you whenever your duties take you beyond the immediate household wing." He paused, something more personal softening the hard edges of his authority. "I should have anticipated this sooner. The moment I elevated you publicly, I placed a target on you that you did not choose and did not deserve." "I do not regret it," Lyra said quietly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "Whatever risk has come from this, I would still choose the same path, if given the chance to decide again." Draven studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, before he finally spoke again, his voice quieter and more guarded than she had yet heard it. "You continue to surprise me, Lyra Ashwood, in ways I did not expect when I found you standing in my chamber, with my cup in your hands. I only hope that whatever surprises still wait ahead of us prove less dangerous than the ones we have already faced." Neither of them could have known, in that quiet moment beside the fire, exactly how much more dangerous those surprises would soon become, as the threads of conspiracy woven around the throne continued tightening, drawing closer with every passing day toward a confrontation that neither king nor maid would be able to avoid. The guard assigned to Lyra's protection was a quiet, watchful young man named Owen, who had served in the palace ranks for nearly 6 years and carried himself with the kind of careful discipline that came from genuine dedication rather than mere obligation. He took his new duty seriously, positioning himself near enough to intervene should trouble arise, yet far enough away to allow Lyra the illusion of privacy during her daily tasks. His presence, though initially uncomfortable, gradually became a source of quiet reassurance rather than intrusion. It was during one of the rare, peaceful evenings that followed, while Owen stood watch outside the small sitting room where Lyra had been asked to organize a collection of old correspondence for the palace archives, that memories she had long kept buried began surfacing unbidden, stirred by the quiet solitude of the task. She found herself thinking of Millbrook, the small village where she had spent the first 14 years of her life, before circumstances forced her into palace service. It had been a peaceful place once, nestled between gentle hills and a slow-moving river, home to farmers and craftsmen who had little interest in the politics of the distant capital. That peace had shattered the summer raiders swept down from the northern borderlands, burning fields and threatening to destroy everything her family and neighbors had built over generations. The king's forces had arrived in time to drive the raiders back, saving the village from complete destruction, but the victory had come at a cost that still ached in Lyra's chest whenever she allowed herself to remember it fully. Her father had died defending the village alongside the royal soldiers, caught in the chaos of battle despite having no formal training beyond a farmer's determination to protect his home. Her older brother had been badly injured, losing the use of his left arm in an accident during the chaotic evacuation of the eastern fields, a wound that had ended his hopes of ever taking over the family farm as planned. In the aftermath, with her father gone and her brother unable to work as he once had, the family's modest savings dwindled quickly, and Lyra, barely more than a child herself, had made the difficult decision to seek palace service in the capital, sending home whatever small wages she could spare, to keep her mother and brother fed through the harsh winters that followed. It was a debt she had never fully articulated, even to herself, but one that had quietly shaped every choice she made in the years since. The king's soldiers had saved her village, yes, but they had also taken her father's life in the process, and somewhere in the complicated tangle of grief and gratitude that followed, Lyra had come to feel a strange, unspoken obligation toward the crown that had both saved and devastated her family in equal measure. It was, she realized now, thinking back on those months of quiet, secret wine tasting that had led her to this strange new position, the true root of everything she had done. She had not simply been protecting a king out of blind loyalty to the throne. She had been trying, in some small and perhaps foolish way, to balance a scale that had never quite settled evenly in her heart, protecting the life of the man whose kingdom had cost her father his, as though doing so might somehow honor the sacrifice rather than simply mourn it. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to find Draven himself standing in the doorway, having apparently dismissed Owen for the evening without her noticing the exchange. He carried none of the formal weight he wore during council sessions, dressed simply in a dark tunic, his expression relaxed in a way she had rarely seen. "Greta mentioned you were working late on the archive correspondence," he said, stepping into the room. "I thought you might appreciate company, or perhaps a reason to stop for the evening." "I do not mind the work," Lyra said, though she set down the papers she had been sorting, grateful for the distraction from memories that had grown heavier than she expected. "It gives me time to think." "About what, if I may ask?" She hesitated, uncertain whether to share something so personal with a man whose position placed such distance between them, despite the strange intimacy that had grown steadily since that first night in his chamber. But something about his quiet patience, the genuine curiosity in his expression rather than mere idle interest, convinced her to answer honestly, as she always seemed to find herself doing with him. "I was thinking about my village," she said. "Millbrook, in the Eastern Valley. Raiders attacked it when I was 14. Your father's soldiers saved what remained of it, though the cost was high for my family specifically." Draven's expression grew serious, and he settled into the chair across from her without being invited, an informality she had come to recognize as uniquely his own within these private moments. "Tell me what happened." She told him the full story then, the fire and chaos of that summer, her father's death, her brother's injury, the quiet desperation that had eventually led her to seek work in the capital. Draven listened without interrupting, his attention so complete and focused that Lyra found herself sharing details she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even Nora, who knew only the barest outline of her past. "I did not know," he said quietly, once she had finished. "I was young myself when that raid occurred, still learning the responsibilities of the crown from my father, rather than carrying them myself. I do not remember the specific details of every border conflict from that period, though I should have made it my business to know such things more thoroughly." "You could not have known everything happening in every village across the kingdom," Lyra said. "That is an impossible standard for any ruler." "Perhaps, but it does not lessen the weight of what your family sacrificed so that my father's soldiers could claim victory that day." He studied her carefully, something gentle and searching in his gaze. "Is that why you began testing my food and wine? Some sense of obligation tied to your father's death?" Lyra considered the question seriously before answering, understanding that he deserved the same honesty she had offered about her past. "I think so, though I did not fully understand it myself until tonight, sitting here with these old letters. I have spent years feeling as though I owed something to the crown, something I could never quite name or repay through ordinary service alone. When I heard those guards whispering about danger to you, it felt like an opportunity to finally do something that mattered, something that might balance whatever debt I felt I carried." "You owe the crown nothing, Lyra," Draven said firmly. "If anything, the debt runs in the opposite direction. My father's forces arrived to protect Millbrook, yes, but the cost your family paid in that protection was never properly acknowledged or repaid. That failure belongs to the crown, not to you. I did not tell you this seeking repayment," she said quickly, worried he had misunderstood her intentions. "I only wanted you to understand why I did what I did that first night, and every night since. I understand it far better now," he said, "and it only deepens my respect for you, rather than diminishing it. Most people who serve out of true loyalty do so for reasons far more selfish than yours, seeking advancement, or favor, or simple survival. You have been carrying grief and guilt disguised as duty, quietly, for years, without ever expecting recognition or reward." The warmth in his voice, so different from the cold authority he displayed before the court, settled something unsteady within Lyra's chest, and for a moment, the careful distance she had maintained between herself and the man sitting across from her felt impossibly thin, ready to dissolve entirely if either of them allowed it. "I should return to sorting these letters," she said softly, though she made no move to pick them back up. "You should rest," Draven countered gently. "The letters will still be here tomorrow, and you have carried enough weight for one evening, without adding tired eyes and aching hands to the burden." He rose from his chair, and for a brief moment, standing close enough that Lyra could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air, she thought he might reach for her hand, or say something further about the strange, careful bond growing steadily between them despite every reason it should not exist. Instead, he simply inclined his head toward her, a gesture far more formal than the conversation that had preceded it, and turned to leave the room. "Good night, Lyra Ashwood," he said from the doorway, glancing back once more, before disappearing into the corridor beyond. "Good night, Your Majesty," she whispered, long after he had already gone, sitting alone in the quiet room with her father's memory, and the king's unexpected kindness, both weighing heavily upon her heart, uncertain which one troubled her more in that fragile, uncertain hour. The council dinner had been planned for weeks, a gathering of the kingdom's most influential lords meant to finalize new trade agreements along the southern border, and Lyra had spent the entire day helping oversee preparations under Greta's exacting supervision, uncertain why her stomach had refused to settle since morning despite nothing specific to justify the unease. "You have checked that seating arrangement 3 times already," Greta said, watching her hover near the long dining table in the grand hall. "Whatever is troubling you, either speak it aloud or set it aside. We cannot afford distracted hands tonight, not with every lord in the southern territories watching for any excuse to claim the crown's hospitality has grown careless." "I do not know what is troubling me," Lyra admitted honestly. "Something simply feels wrong, though I cannot point to any specific cause." Greta's expression grew serious, remembering, as Lyra did, exactly how such vague unease had once before proven entirely justified. "Trust that feeling, girl. Watch everything tonight, more closely than usual." The guests began arriving as evening fell, filling the grand hall with the low murmur of political conversation and the clink of goblets being filled with wine from the palace's finest reserves. Lyra moved through the preparations with heightened alertness, tasting each dish before it left the kitchen exactly as she had done every night since her position began, finding nothing amiss in the careful, methodical checking of every course. It was not until the third course arrived, a delicate fish dish prepared with rare southern spices, specifically to honor the visiting lords from that region, that her instincts flared with sudden, sharp alarm. She had tasted a small portion from the main preparation tray in the kitchen, finding nothing wrong, but as she watched the servers begin plating individual portions for each guest, something about the timing troubled her, a gap of several minutes between her tasting and the actual serving that felt longer than it should have been. She moved quickly through the kitchen, scanning the row of plated dishes waiting to be carried into the hall, and her breath caught when she noticed one plate, meant for Lord Alden Voss's own seat according to the careful place cards prepared earlier, positioned slightly apart from the others near the edge of the counter. Her heart pounding, she leaned close to examine it, and beneath the delicate garnish of herbs, she noticed a faint discoloration along one edge of the fish that had not been present in the portion she tasted moments earlier. It was subtle, easily missed by anyone not specifically searching for irregularities, but unmistakable once noticed. "Do not serve this plate," she said sharply to the footman reaching for it, her voice carrying enough authority that he froze immediately despite his confusion. "It is meant for Lord Voss's seat, exactly as instructed. I do not care whose seat it is meant for. Something has been added to it since I tasted the original preparation. Fetch the head cook immediately, and do not let anyone touch the other plates until I have checked each one individually." Her urgent tone drew Greta's attention from across the busy kitchen, and within moments, the entire room had fallen into tense, watchful silence as Lyra methodically re-examined every plate destined for the dining hall, her hands steady, despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. She found nothing else amiss, only the single plate meant for Alden Voss, which the healer, summoned urgently once again, confirmed contained a substance capable of causing severe illness within hours of consumption, though not immediately fatal in the small quantity present. The implications of the discovery struck Lyra with dizzying force as she stood in the busy kitchen, the healer's grim confirmation still echoing in her ears. Someone had attempted to poison Alden Voss, not the king, during a dinner meant to strengthen relations between the crown and the southern territories. If the attempt had succeeded, and Alden had fallen ill or died at the king's own table, the political consequences would have been catastrophic, potentially igniting exactly the kind of conflict between the crown and the southern lords that would benefit only those seeking to weaken the kingdom from within. Draven arrived within minutes of being informed, his expression carefully composed despite the tension radiating from every line of his posture as he absorbed the details of what had nearly occurred. "You are certain the poison was added after Lyra's initial tasting, and specifically to this one plate?" "Completely certain, Your Majesty," the healer confirmed. "The timing and the isolated nature of the contamination suggest deliberate, targeted action, rather than a general threat to the kitchen's preparations. Someone within these walls attempted to poison Lord Voss, at my own table, during negotiations, meant to secure peace with the southern territories." Draven's voice carried a controlled fury that Lyra had not heard from him before, even during the earlier poisoning attempt against his own life. If this had succeeded, every southern lord in that hall would have believed I orchestrated the death of one of their own, deliberately, as an act of betrayal disguised as hospitality. The full weight of the conspiracy's cleverness settled over the room, as everyone present began to understand the true scope of what had nearly happened. This was not simply an attempt to remove the king through poison. It was a calculated effort to destroy the fragile alliance between the crown and the southern territories, sowing chaos and suspicion that could fracture the kingdom entirely, regardless of whether Draven himself survived any individual attempt. "We cannot let Lord Voss learn the details of what nearly happened tonight, at least not yet," Draven decided quickly, his mind clearly working through the political implications with practiced speed, despite the shock still evident beneath his composed exterior. If word spreads that someone attempted to poison him within these walls, even with the attempt successfully prevented, the southern lords may still interpret it as evidence of the crown's inability to guarantee their safety, or worse, as proof of hostile intent hidden beneath diplomatic courtesy. "What will you tell him regarding the delay in his meal, Your Majesty?" Greta asked practically. "A simple kitchen error, easily explained and quickly corrected." Draven turned to Lyra, his expression softening slightly, despite the tension still gripping the room. "You will need to prepare an alternate dish immediately, identical enough to satisfy any question, while we investigate quietly how the contaminated portion came to be prepared without drawing attention to the true danger that was averted." The remainder of the dinner proceeded with careful, controlled normalcy, Lord Voss receiving his delayed meal with only a brief apologetic explanation about kitchen timing, entirely unaware of how close he had come to genuine danger at the king's own table. Lyra watched him throughout the remainder of the evening from her position near the kitchen entrance, studying his interactions with the other lords, searching for any sign that he suspected the truth of what had nearly occurred. If Alden Voss knew anything about the attempt on his own life, he gave no indication of it, engaging in the evening's political discussions with his usual smooth confidence, occasionally glancing toward Lyra with the same cold assessment she had grown accustomed to since their encounter in the garden. It struck her, watching him laugh at some remark from a fellow lord, entirely unaware of the danger that had passed so close beside him, that the true architect of these attacks remained frustratingly invisible, hidden somewhere among the very people gathered in this hall to celebrate peace and cooperation. Once the dinner concluded and the guests had retired to their quarters for the evening, Draven convened a small private gathering in his study, including only Lyra, Edmund, and the head of palace security, a stern woman named Clara who had served in her position for over a decade, without a single security breach on her record until recent weeks. "2 attempts now, within the span of a single month," Draven said grimly, pacing the length of his study with restless energy. "The first targeting me directly, the second targeting a visiting lord, both executed with enough skill to nearly succeed despite our heightened vigilance. Whoever is responsible for this has access to the kitchens, knowledge of specific seating arrangements, and enough patience to wait for precisely the right moment to act. The list of individuals with access to both the kitchen and the seating arrangements for tonight's dinner is unfortunately quite long, Your Majesty," Clara said, consulting a small ledger she had brought with her. "Nearly 40 members of staff had some involvement in tonight's preparations, any one of whom could theoretically have introduced the contamination during a moment of distraction. Then we narrow the list through other means," Draven said. "Who among those 40 individuals has connections to Alden Voss's household, or to any noble family with grievances against either the crown or the southern territories specifically?" Clara promised to compile such a list by morning, and the meeting continued late into the night, examining every angle of the 2 attacks, searching for patterns or connections that might reveal the identity of whoever orchestrated them. Lyra contributed what observations she could, describing the exact positioning of the contaminated plate, the timing gap she had noticed, details that Clara noted carefully as potentially useful in narrowing the investigation. It was well past midnight by the time the gathering finally dispersed, and Lyra found herself walking slowly back toward her small chamber within the household wing, exhaustion settling heavily into her bones after the tense, draining events of the evening. Owen fell into step beside her as usual, his watchful presence a quiet comfort in the dim, empty corridors of the sleeping palace. "You did well tonight," he said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "If you had not caught that plate in time, the consequences could have been severe, for the kingdom, as much as for Lord Voss himself." "I keep thinking about how close it came to succeeding," Lyra admitted, a few minutes later, "and I would not have noticed the discoloration in time." "But you did notice it, that is what matters." Owen glanced sideways at her, something thoughtful in his expression. Whoever is doing this clearly did not anticipate someone paying such close attention to every detail. That has become their weakness, and it seems to be one they have not yet learned to correct. Lyra hoped fervently that he was right, though a cold, persistent worry lingered in her chest as she finally reached her chamber and allowed herself to collapse onto her narrow bed, too exhausted to change out of her uniform before sleep claimed her. Whoever stood behind these attacks had proven twice now that they possessed both the access and the patience to strike close to the throne, and Lyra could not shake the growing certainty that the game being played around her was far larger and far more dangerous than anyone within the palace had yet fully understood. The list Clara presented 3 days later narrowed the suspects considerably, though not enough to point conclusively toward any single individual. Of the 40 staff members with access to the dinner preparations, only 6 had any documented connection to noble households outside the direct royal family, and of those 6, only 1, a young undercook named Ferris, had ties to a family that had once served the Voss household before seeking employment within the royal kitchens 2 years earlier. "It is a thin connection," Clara admitted during the private briefing held once again in Draven's study. "But it is the strongest lead we currently possess. I would like your permission to question him directly, Your Majesty, though I want to proceed carefully. If he is innocent, and merely unfortunate enough to share a distant family connection to Lord Voss's former household, an aggressive interrogation could damage morale among the staff and create unnecessary fear throughout the palace." "Question him," Draven agreed, "but do so with Lyra present, if she is willing. She has proven remarkably perceptive at noticing details others overlook, and an extra set of careful eyes during the questioning may reveal something your formal investigation alone would miss." Lyra agreed readily, though nervousness churned in her stomach at the prospect of participating so directly in what amounted to an interrogation, a task far removed from anything her years of quiet service had prepared her for. Ferris proved to be a thin, nervous young man barely older than Lyra herself, his hands trembling visibly as he was brought before Clara and the king for questioning, clearly terrified despite having, as far as anyone could determine, done nothing wrong. "I had no involvement in preparing Lord Voss's specific dish," Ferris insisted, his voice cracking under the weight of the king's presence. "I worked the ovens that evening, nowhere near the plating station where the fish course was assembled. Anyone in the kitchen can confirm my position throughout the preparations." Clara pressed him further, regarding his family's former connection to the Voss household, and Ferris explained, with growing desperation, that his mother had served briefly as a laundry maid for the Voss family, over a decade earlier, long before any current tensions had developed, and that he himself had never once met Lord Voss or any member of his current household staff. Watching the exchange carefully, Lyra found herself increasingly convinced of the young man's innocence, his fear appearing genuine, rather than the calculated nervousness of someone concealing guilt. It was only as the questioning concluded, and Ferris was preparing to leave the room with obvious relief, that Lyra noticed something small but significant, a detail that had been nagging at the edge of her attention throughout the entire exchange. "Wait," she said quietly, and Ferris froze mid-step, fear flooding back into his expression. "I am not accusing you of anything. I only wanted to ask about the ring you are wearing." Ferris glanced down at his hand, where a small, plain silver ring adorned his finger, unremarkable in every way, except for a tiny engraved symbol, along its inner edge, that Lyra had glimpsed briefly, as he gestured while speaking. "It was a gift," he said slowly, confusion evident in his voice, "from someone I have been courting quietly for several months now, a woman who works within the palace laundry. May I see it more closely?" Ferris removed the ring hesitantly and handed it to her, and Lyra examined the small engraved symbol carefully, a stylized rendering of a hawk in flight that she recognized immediately from documents she had seen during her time sorting the Royal Archive correspondence weeks earlier. "This is the Voss family crest," she said quietly, looking up at Clara and Draven with growing certainty. "A simplified version, but unmistakably theirs." The room fell silent, as the implications settled over everyone present. Ferris, pale with sudden understanding, stammered an explanation that gradually emerged as the true thread connecting everything together. The woman who had given him the ring, a laundry maid named Wren, had recently joined the palace staff after leaving service in a noble household in the Southern Territories, though not the Voss household directly as initially suspected, but rather that of a lesser lord, closely allied with Alden Voss through long-standing family ties. "She told me the ring belonged to her grandmother," Ferris said, clearly shaken by the realization that his innocent romantic attachment had somehow connected him, however unwittingly, to the very conspiracy under investigation. "I never once suspected she might have any involvement in something so dangerous." Wren was located and brought before the king within the hour, and unlike Ferris, her composure did not crack easily under questioning, though the evidence gradually mounting against her proved impossible to fully deny. Careful examination of her recent movements within the palace, cross-referenced against the timing of both poisoning attempts, revealed opportunities that aligned suspiciously well with each incident. I have done nothing wrong, Wren insisted, though her voice had lost the confident edge it carried at the beginning of the questioning. I am a laundry maid. I have no access to the kitchens, no reason to be near the dinner preparations on either occasion in question. And yet witnesses place you near the kitchen corridor on both nights, well outside your usual duties, Clara countered, consulting notes she had gathered from other staff members during the preceding hours. Convenient timing for someone with no involvement in the kitchen's operations. Under mounting pressure, Wren's careful composure finally began to crack, and the truth emerged in halting, reluctant fragments. She had indeed been recruited, months earlier, by a representative of a noble house allied with the Voss family, though she claimed, with desperate insistence, that she did not know the full scope of the plan she had been drawn into, believing initially that she was merely gathering information about palace routines and schedules, rather than facilitating actual poisoning attempts. They told me it was only reconnaissance, she said, tears finally breaking through her earlier defiance. I did not know they intended actual harm, until it was already happening, and by then, I was too frightened to refuse further involvement, certain that whatever they had planned for the king or Lord Voss would eventually be blamed on me, regardless of my cooperation. Who gave you these instructions? Draven demanded, his patience clearly wearing thin, despite his controlled exterior. I never met him directly. Messages came through intermediaries. Always different people. Always careful. Never to reveal names or faces clearly. Wren's voice shook badly now. I only know that whoever is behind this wants something far larger than simply removing you from the throne. Your Majesty, I overheard fragments of conversation once, about placing someone easily controlled in your position instead, someone who could be guided by more experienced hands from behind the scenes. The revelation sent a fresh wave of tension through the room, confirming what Draven and his advisors had suspected but not yet proven, that the conspiracy extended far beyond a simple assassination attempt, aiming instead toward a complete restructuring of power within the kingdom itself. A puppet ruler, controlled by ambitious nobles working carefully from the shadows, would achieve far more lasting influence than a straightforward seizure of the throne through obvious violence, avoiding the immediate backlash that outright treason would provoke, while still achieving the same ultimate goal. And Lord Voss's poisoning, Lyra asked quietly, still processing the tangled web of deception being revealed before them. Was he truly meant to die, or was there some other purpose behind targeting him specifically? Wren hesitated, clearly uncertain how much further to reveal, before finally answering with obvious reluctance. I believe he was meant to fall seriously ill, though not necessarily die from it. His illness, occurring at the king's own table, would have created exactly the kind of diplomatic crisis needed to weaken trust between the crown and the southern territories, opening space for new leadership to emerge from within that discord, leadership more favorable to whoever is truly orchestrating this scheme. The pieces continued falling into place throughout the remainder of that long, exhausting night, though Wren's limited knowledge left frustrating gaps regarding the identity of the true mastermind behind the conspiracy. She was placed under careful guard, pending further investigation, along with a shaken but apparently innocent Ferris, whose unfortunate romantic entanglement had inadvertently led to the conspiracy's first significant unraveling. As the palace finally settled into uneasy quiet in the small hours before dawn, Draven found Lyra still awake in the small sitting room where their earlier conversation about Millbrook had taken place, unable to fully process the magnitude of what had been revealed that night. You noticed a ring, he said quietly, settling into the chair across from her once again. A small detail that everyone else in that room, myself included, would have overlooked entirely. That observation alone may have saved us months of fruitless investigation. I only noticed it because I had recently spent time studying the family crests in the archive correspondence, Lyra said, still somewhat stunned by how significant her small observation had proven to be. It was simple luck, nothing more. I am beginning to think, Draven said, studying her with quiet intensity, that whatever combination of luck and attentiveness you possess, it may prove to be exactly what saves this kingdom from a conspiracy far more dangerous than either of us initially understood. We are not simply protecting my life anymore, Lyra. We are protecting the very stability of the throne itself. The weight of that realization settled heavily over both of them as the first pale light of dawn began creeping through the windows, illuminating a path forward that had grown considerably more perilous and considerably more urgent than either of them could have anticipated when this strange partnership first began, with nothing more than a stolen sip of wine. In the weeks following Ren's confession, the palace settled into a strange, watchful calm, the investigation continuing quietly, beneath the surface of ordinary court life, while everyone involved understood that the true architect of the conspiracy remained hidden, patient, and undoubtedly aware that his lower operatives had been discovered. Draven doubled the guard throughout the palace, tightened access to the kitchens even further, and began meeting privately with only his most trusted advisors to discuss the investigation's progress, careful never to reveal sensitive details in settings where unknown ears might overhear. Through it all, the bond between Draven and Lyra continued deepening in ways neither of them fully acknowledged aloud, though both were increasingly aware of it. Their evening conversations, once limited strictly to matters of security and investigation, gradually expanded to include quieter, more personal exchanges, moments where the king's guarded exterior softened enough to reveal the tired, thoughtful man beneath the crown's heavy expectations. "Do you ever wish you had never become king?" Lyra asked him one evening, as they sat together in the small garden courtyard that had become their unofficial meeting place after the day's formal duties concluded. "The weight of it seems exhausting, carrying the safety of an entire kingdom on your shoulders." "Every day," Draven admitted, surprising her with the honesty of his answer. "I was raised for this role from childhood, trained in statecraft and warfare and diplomacy, before I was old enough to understand what any of it truly meant. There was never a moment where I chose this path freely. It was simply given to me, the way a stone is given its shape by the river that carves it, whether the stone wishes to be shaped or not." "That sounds lonely," Lyra said softly. "It has been, for most of my life." He glanced at her, something vulnerable flickering behind his usually composed expression. "Until recently." The quiet weight of his words settled between them, and Lyra felt her heart quicken in a way that had become increasingly familiar during their private moments together. A warmth she had initially dismissed as simple gratitude for his trust, but which had grown into something far more complicated and far more difficult to ignore with each passing week. "Your Majesty." "Draven," he corrected gently. "When we are alone like this, I would prefer you use my name." "Draven," she repeated, testing the intimacy of it carefully. "I do not know what is developing between us, but I worry it is not wise, given everything else happening around us. If Alden Voss or whoever stands behind him learns that you have developed feelings for a servant, it could create exactly the kind of vulnerability they have been searching for." "You believe I have developed feelings for you," Draven said, not quite a question, his eyes steady on hers in the fading evening light. Lyra's breath caught, uncertain whether she had overstepped some invisible boundary by speaking so plainly about something neither of them had explicitly acknowledged before. "I believe something has grown between us that goes beyond simple duty and gratitude, yes. I have felt it myself, and I do not think I am imagining it reflected in you as well." "You are not imagining it," Draven said quietly, moving closer to her on the stone bench they shared, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, despite the cool evening air surrounding them. "I have spent every day since that first night trying to convince myself that what I feel is simple gratitude, or admiration for your courage, easily explained away by the circumstances that brought us together. But it has grown into something I can no longer dismiss so easily. Lyra, however inconvenient the timing, however dangerous the implications." Her heart pounded fiercely as his hand found hers on the bench between them, his fingers warm and careful against her own, as though he feared she might pull away at the contact. She did not pull away. "An Alpha King and an Omega servant," she whispered, giving voice to the impossibility of it, even as her hand remained curled within his. "The court would never accept such a match, regardless of whatever feelings exist between us." "The court accepts what I decide it will accept," Draven said, though his voice carried none of the harsh authority he typically wielded before his advisors, only quiet certainty. "I have spent my entire reign bending to the expectations others placed upon me, choosing duty over desire in every decision that mattered. I find myself, for the first time, genuinely unwilling to make that same choice again." "There is still a conspiracy threatening your throne," Lyra reminded him gently, though every part of her wished desperately to simply lean into the warmth of his hand and forget, if only briefly, the dangers still surrounding them both. Whatever exists between us, it must wait until that danger has passed. I could not bear it if my presence beside you became the very weakness someone used to finally succeed where poison has already failed twice. Draven studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between the truth of her caution and the reluctance he felt at accepting any further delay in acknowledging what had grown between them. Finally he nodded, though his hand remained wrapped around hers a moment longer before releasing it with obvious reluctance. "You are right, as you so often seem to be," he said, a rare, small smile touching his lips, despite the seriousness of the moment. "We will wait until this threat has been fully resolved. But know this, Lyra Ashwood, whatever conspiracy is unfolding around us, whatever danger still lies ahead, my feelings for you are not going to fade simply because caution demands patience. When this is finally over, I intend to make my intentions toward you known clearly, before the entire court if necessary." The promise settled warmly in her chest even as anxiety about the unresolved danger continued churning beneath it, and Lyra found herself, for the first time since arriving at the palace years earlier, allowing herself to imagine a future that extended beyond simple survival and quiet service. A future where she might stand beside this complicated, dutiful man, not as his servant, but as someone he had chosen freely, despite every obstacle working against such a choice. That fragile hope carried her through the following days with renewed determination, even as the investigation into the conspiracy continued, yielding frustratingly little additional progress. Clara's careful surveillance of Alden Voss revealed nothing conclusively incriminating, his public behavior remaining scrupulously proper despite the suspicion surrounding him, and Wren's limited knowledge provided no further names or details beyond what she had already confessed. It was Owen, during one of his quiet evening watches outside Lyra's chamber, who first brought word of a development that would ultimately prove far more significant than anyone initially realized. "There is unusual activity happening near the eastern gate," he told her quietly one night, having just returned from his rounds through that section of the palace grounds. "Deliveries, arriving at unusual hours, carried by men I do not recognize among the regular merchant staff. I mentioned it to Clara, but she has been stretched thin investigating the existing leads and has not yet had opportunity to look into it directly." "What kind of deliveries?" Lyra asked, her instincts sharpening immediately at the mention of anything unusual. "Crates, mostly. Marked as ordinary supplies for the kitchen and household stores, though the timing seems strange for legitimate merchant deliveries. Most trade arrives during daylight hours, when the gates are fully staffed and easily monitored. These have been coming well after dark, twice now over the past week." The information settled into Lyra's mind alongside everything else she had learned during the ongoing investigation, and though she could not immediately identify how it connected to the broader conspiracy, her instincts told her, with the same certainty that had guided her through every previous discovery, that this unusual pattern deserved far closer attention than it had yet received. "Will you show me where these deliveries have been arriving?" she asked. "Tomorrow night, if another delivery is expected." Owen hesitated, clearly uncertain about involving her directly in what might prove to be dangerous surveillance work far beyond her usual duties. "The king would not approve of you placing yourself at further risk, especially given everything already threatening your safety." "The king is not here to object," Lyra said, with a determination that surprised even herself. "And if these deliveries are connected to whoever is behind the poisoning attempts, waiting for Clara to find time amid her other duties could allow them to complete whatever plan they are executing. I would rather take a careful risk now than regret inaction later." Owen studied her for a long moment before finally nodding, his expression grave but resigned. "Tomorrow night then, but we proceed with extreme caution, and if anything seems even slightly dangerous, we retreat immediately and report to Clara, rather than attempting to handle it ourselves." Lyra agreed readily, though as she settled into her bed that night, sleep proving elusive despite her exhaustion, she could not shake the growing sense that whatever waited near that eastern gate would prove to be the crucial piece connecting every fragment of the conspiracy together, the final thread that would finally reveal the true mastermind, hiding patiently behind Alden Voss's cold ambition and Wren's frightened confession alike. The following night, Lyra and Owen positioned themselves carefully within the shadows of a storage building near the eastern gate, waiting in tense silence as the palace grounds settled into their usual nighttime quiet around them. Nearly 2 hours passed before the soft creak of the gate mechanism announced the arrival Owen had predicted, a modest cart rolling through under the dim light of a single lantern, guided by two men Lyra did not recognize among the regular palace staff. She watched carefully as the men unloaded several wooden crates, exchanging quiet words with the gate guard on duty that night, a young soldier whose posture suggested familiarity with this arrangement, rather than the alertness one might expect from an unexpected late delivery. Money changed hands briefly between the guard and one of the delivery men, confirming Owen's suspicion that this was no ordinary merchant transaction. "He is being paid to allow unauthorized access," Owen whispered, his hand instinctively moving toward the hilt of his sword. "This goes beyond simple unusual timing. Someone has bribed palace security directly." They watched as the crates were carried not toward the kitchen storage areas as their markings suggested, but instead toward a rarely used section of the palace cellars, an area primarily storing old furniture and archived documents rather than active household supplies. Lyra's pulse quickened with the certainty that they had discovered something significant, though the true nature of it remained frustratingly unclear from their concealed vantage point. "We should follow them," she whispered, though Owen's hand on her arm held her back. "We agreed to retreat and report if anything seemed dangerous. This qualifies. We do not yet know what is in those crates. If we retreat now without learning more, Clara will need days to investigate this properly, and whatever is happening might already be complete by then." Lyra's voice remained low but firm. "We only need to observe long enough to understand what we are truly dealing with. Then we retreat immediately and report everything to the king and Clara together." Reluctantly, Owen agreed, and they moved carefully through the shadows, following at a cautious distance, as the delivery men and the bribed guard carried the crates deep into the disused cellar section. Through a gap in an old wooden door left slightly ajar, Lyra caught her first clear glimpse of the crate's contents, as one was pried open for inspection, and her stomach dropped with immediate, sickening understanding. Weapons. Carefully packed swords and crossbows, along with smaller crates that likely contained additional supplies for armed conflict, hidden away within the palace's own walls, accessible to whoever intended to use them when the moment finally arrived. "This is not simply poison anymore," she breathed, horror settling deep into her chest. "They are preparing for something far more direct, an armed confrontation, hidden within the palace itself." Before Owen could respond, a sound behind them made both of them freeze, the unmistakable click of a crossbow being readied for use. They turned slowly to find themselves facing not one of the delivery men, but Alden Voss himself, emerging from the shadows with a cold, satisfied expression that confirmed every suspicion that had gathered around him for weeks. "How disappointing," he said quietly, his crossbow held steady and aimed directly at them. "I had hoped my earlier warning in the garden might have convinced you to remain appropriately cautious, Lyra Ashwood. It seems curiosity has overcome your good sense entirely." "You are behind all of it," Lyra said, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the fear coursing through her at the sight of the weapon pointed her way. "The poisoning attempts, the weapons hidden in these cellars. You intend to seize the throne through force." "Not seize it myself precisely," Alden corrected, his tone carrying the same smooth arrogance she remembered from the council chamber and the garden alike. "I have no interest in wearing a crown that would make me the target of every ambitious rival across the kingdom. I prefer influence exercised more quietly, through a ruler who understands the wisdom of listening carefully to those who helped secure his position." "So Draven's cousin," Owen said suddenly, understanding dawning in his voice. "Lord Cassian. He has always resented being passed over for the succession in favor of Draven, despite his closer temperament to what the southern lords prefer." Alden's smile widened slightly, confirming Owen's guess without explicitly stating it. "Cassian is considerably more amenable to reasonable counsel than his cousin has proven to be. Once Draven is removed, through whatever means finally prove necessary, Cassian's claim to the throne will be the strongest remaining option, and he has already agreed, quietly, to certain arrangements regarding trade policy and southern autonomy that Draven has stubbornly refused to consider." "You would start a war within the palace itself to achieve this," Lyra said, horrified by the scope of ambition being revealed. "Innocent guards, servants, anyone caught in the confrontation when these weapons are finally used. Necessary sacrifices for a more stable future," Alden replied coldly. "Though I confess, I had hoped to avoid such direct measures. The poison would have been considerably cleaner, had you not proven so inconveniently perceptive on both occasions. His gaze fixed on Lyra with something approaching genuine hatred now. You have cost me considerable time and resources, girl, and I do not intend to allow you the opportunity to interfere further. The crossbow shifted slightly, and Lyra's heart seized with terror, as she realized how genuinely close they stood to real, permanent danger, far beyond the abstract threat of poison she had grown accustomed to navigating. Before Alden could act further, however, the sound of multiple footsteps echoed through the cellar corridor behind him, and his expression shifted from cold satisfaction to sudden alarm as he realized he was no longer alone with his intended targets. Clara emerged from the shadows, with a dozen armed guards behind her, having apparently followed Owen and Lyra's trail once their absence from their expected posts had been noticed and investigated. Draven himself appeared moments later, his expression carrying a fury Lyra had never before witnessed, cold and absolute, in a way that made even Alden's confidence waver visibly. "Lower your weapon, Lord Voss," Draven commanded, his voice carrying throughout the cellar with unmistakable authority. "You are surrounded, and whatever twisted plan you have constructed with my cousin's cooperation has already been discovered. There is no path forward here that ends favorably for you." Alden hesitated, his crossbow still raised toward Lyra and Owen, clearly calculating whether some desperate final action might yet salvage his position, despite the overwhelming odds now arrayed against him. "If I am taken, Your Majesty, the weapons and evidence gathered here will still exist, testament to a conspiracy that reaches further than you currently understand. My removal alone will not save you from what has already been set into motion. Then we will address whatever remains of your conspiracy through proper investigation and justice, rather than through the chaos you clearly hope to unleash tonight." Draven's voice did not waver. "Lower your weapon, Alden. This ends now, one way or another." For a tense, breathless moment, it seemed as though Alden might choose violence regardless of the impossible odds against him, his finger tightening almost imperceptibly against the crossbow's trigger. Then, with visible reluctance, he lowered the weapon, understanding finally that no path remained available to him except surrender, however bitterly he clearly resented the necessity of it. The guards moved swiftly to restrain him, and as they led him away in chains toward whatever justice awaited him, Draven turned immediately toward Lyra, his composed authority cracking entirely into raw, unguarded relief as he crossed the distance between them and pulled her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could have of exactly how frightened he had been upon learning of the danger she had walked into. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotion, as he held her close. "Both of you. I told you to be careful, to report anything unusual, rather than investigating alone." "I am sorry," Lyra said, her own voice shaking, now that the immediate danger had passed, and the full weight of how close they had come to disaster finally settled over her. "I did not intend to place myself in such direct danger. I only wanted to help resolve this before more harm could be done." "You have helped more than you know," Draven said, pulling back slightly to look at her properly, his hands still gripping her shoulders, as though reluctant to release her entirely. "Because of what you and Owen discovered tonight, we now have physical evidence of the conspiracy, weapons hidden within my own palace, and confirmation of my cousin's involvement in a plot that could have torn this kingdom apart from within. Whatever danger you face tonight, it has given us exactly what we needed to end this threat completely." As the cellar around them filled with guards securing the weapons, and Clara beginning the meticulous work of cataloging evidence, Lyra allowed herself, finally, to lean into Draven's steady presence, understanding that whatever remained to be resolved regarding Alden Voss and Lord Cassian's cousin ambitions, the most dangerous chapter of this conspiracy had finally reached its conclusion, and the path ahead, however complicated it might yet prove, no longer carried the same immediate shadowy threat that had haunted every day since that first stolen sip of poisoned wine. News of Lord Cassian's arrest, delivered quietly and efficiently by royal guards, dispatched to his estate, before word of Alden Voss's capture could reach him, spread through the palace with remarkable speed, despite Draven's efforts to manage the disclosure carefully. Cassian, unlike his co-conspirator, offered little resistance when confronted with the evidence gathered from the cellar, his ambitions apparently far less resilient than his willingness to accept the benefits Alden Voss had promised him. The full scope of the conspiracy emerged over the following days, through careful, methodical investigation. Cassian, resentful for years over being passed over in the line of succession, despite believing his temperament better suited to negotiating with the increasingly restless Southern territories, had allowed Alden Voss to slowly draw him into a scheme that promised him the throne, without requiring him to bear the full weight of its treasonous execution. Weapons had been smuggled in over several months. Poison had been sourced through Voss family connections to less scrupulous merchants along the southern trade routes, and a network of bribed guards and recruited servants like Wren had been carefully assembled to provide access and information whenever needed. "You built quite an extensive operation," Draven observed during Alden's formal questioning before the full council, his voice carrying cold authority, despite the exhaustion evident beneath it after days of managing the crisis. Months of careful planning, considerable resources invested, and ultimately undone by a servant girl who happened to notice a discoloration in a piece of fish. Alden's expression remained defiant, even in chains, though something bitter had replaced his earlier smooth confidence. "Even the most carefully constructed plans can fall to unexpected variables, Your Majesty. I underestimated her. I will not make that mistake again, should circumstances ever grant me the opportunity." "You will not have that opportunity," Draven said flatly. "The evidence gathered against you is thorough and undeniable, confirmed by both Wren's testimony and the weapons discovered in my own cellars. You will face justice for treason against the crown, as will Cassian, and any others found to have knowingly participated in this conspiracy." The formal trial proceedings that followed occupied several tense weeks, during which the kingdom watched with rapt attention as the full details of the conspiracy were revealed publicly, confirming for every noble house and common citizen alike exactly how close the crown had come to catastrophic upheaval. Lyra found herself called to testify regarding her discoveries throughout the investigation, standing before the assembled council and visiting representatives from the southern territories, with a composure that surprised even herself, having grown considerably more confident since that first terrified night when Draven caught her mid-sip in his private chamber. "I only did what felt necessary at each moment," she told the assembled council, when asked to explain her motivations throughout the unfolding crisis. "I did not seek recognition or reward. I simply could not stand by while danger threatened people I had come to care about, whether that danger came in the form of poison or armed conspiracy." Her testimony, combined with the overwhelming physical evidence already gathered, sealed the fate of both conspirators decisively. Alden Voss and Lord Cassian were stripped of their titles and lands, their considerable holdings redistributed among loyal families who had supported the crown throughout the crisis, and both men sentenced to lengthy imprisonment within the kingdom's most secure fortress, far from any opportunity to rebuild influence or attempt future schemes against the throne. With the conspiracy finally resolved and the immediate danger to the kingdom's stability addressed, the palace gradually settled back into its ordinary rhythms, though the events of the preceding months had left lasting changes in their wake. Ferris and Wren, having ultimately cooperated fully with the investigation despite their initial involvement in the conspiracy, received considerably lighter punishment than the primary conspirators, dismissed from palace service, but spared imprisonment in recognition of their eventual honesty and apparent lack of full understanding regarding the scheme's true scope when they first became entangled in it. It was nearly a month after Alden Voss's formal sentencing that Draven finally called for a grand gathering of the full court, ostensibly to celebrate the kingdom's successful navigation through the crisis and to formally recognize those who had contributed to uncovering the conspiracy. Lyra attended dressed in a fine gown provided specifically for the occasion, feeling profoundly out of place among the assembled nobles despite months of growing familiarity with the palace's inner workings, uncertain what exactly Draven intended for this formal celebration, beyond the vague assurances he had offered her in the days leading up to it. The great hall filled with representatives from every noble house across the kingdom, along with the full household staff who had witnessed the crisis unfold from within the palace's own walls. Draven stood before them all, dressed in the formal regalia befitting his position, his expression carrying none of the exhaustion that had marked the preceding weeks, replaced instead by a quiet, determined confidence that made Lyra's heart quicken with anticipation, despite her uncertainty about what precisely he intended to say. "Several months ago," Draven began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the silent hall, This kingdom faced a conspiracy that threatened not only my own life, but the very stability of the crown itself. That conspiracy was uncovered and ultimately defeated, not through the efforts of trained guards or experienced advisors alone, but through the courage and perceptiveness of someone who held no formal position of power within this palace when the crisis first began. Lyra felt every eye in the hall turn toward her, and she fought the instinct to shrink beneath the sudden attention, remembering instead everything she had learned over the preceding months about facing danger and scrutiny, with steady composure rather than fear. Lyra Ashwood entered my service as a lower maid, unnoticed and unremarkable by the standards this court typically applies to measuring worth. Draven continued, his eyes finding hers across the crowded hall, with an intensity that made the distance between them feel far smaller than it truly was. Yet she risked her own safety, repeatedly, to protect a crown that had never once acknowledged her existence, driven by a sense of loyalty and courage that this court would do well to recognize as considerably rarer and more valuable than noble birth or political ambition. He paused, and the hall remained utterly silent, waiting for whatever announcement his words were building toward. In recognition of her service to this kingdom, and in acknowledgement of the bond that has grown between us throughout these difficult months, I intend to formally elevate Lyra Ashwood to a position within this court befitting the trust and respect she has earned. Furthermore, and here his voice softened slightly, though it lost none of its carrying strength, I intend to make my personal intentions toward her known clearly, before all of you, so that no doubt remains regarding the place she holds in both this court and in my own heart. Draven crossed the hall directly toward her, ignoring the murmurs rippling through the assembled nobles at the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding before them, and knelt before her, an act so shocking from a reigning king that several nobles gasped audibly at the sight of it. "Lyra Ashwood," he said, his voice carrying quiet sincerity, despite the formal audience surrounding them. "You entered my life through an act of quiet courage that I did not deserve, and had done nothing to earn. Since that night, you have protected this kingdom, challenged my assumptions, and shown me a version of loyalty and love I did not believe still existed within a court so often consumed by ambition and self-interest. I am asking you now, before my entire court, to accept my hand, not as a king commanding a servant, but as a man who has come to love you completely, and who wishes to build whatever future remains ahead of us together, as equals bound by choice rather than circumstance." Tears filled Lyra's eyes as she looked down at him, the weight of everything they had endured together settling into a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy that felt almost impossible to fully believe after months of danger and uncertainty. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Yes, I accept." The hall erupted into applause and cheers, the nobles who had once viewed her with suspicion or dismissal, now witnessing the formal transformation of a timid palace maid into the future Queen of Aldmere, her journey from invisible servant to trusted protector, finally reaching its rightful conclusion. Draven rose and pulled her into an embrace, careless of the watching court, and Lyra felt, for the first time in her life, the profound relief of being fully seen, fully valued, and fully loved by someone whose regard she had never once believed herself worthy of receiving. In the weeks that followed, as preparations began for a wedding that would unite not only two hearts but symbolically heal the wounds the conspiracy had inflicted upon the kingdom's stability, Lyra often found herself thinking back to that terrified night when Draven had caught her mid-sip of his wine, certain in that moment that her life within the palace had reached its abrupt end. Instead, that single moment of discovered courage had led her to exactly the life she had never dared imagine for herself, standing beside a king who valued her not, despite her humble origins, but because of the quiet strength and unwavering loyalty those origins had shaped within her. Nora, overjoyed at her friend's remarkable transformation, often teased her about the strange, winding path that had led from stolen sips of wine to a royal wedding, though Lyra never tired of reminding her that none of it had felt like fortune or fate in the moment, only fear, duty, and a stubborn refusal to remain silent when something felt wrong. It was that same quiet courage, rather than any grand ambition, that had ultimately reshaped her entire life, proving that even the smallest, most timid voice could change the course of a kingdom, provided it refused to stay silent when it truly mattered.